Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Coffee with Thorben. I hope you're doing great. Um, Today I've prepared a few questions from the blog as always, and I'm looking forward to answer your question here live on stream. So if you have any questions, post them in the chat. If there's anything you want to talk about, let me know, and then we see what we can do within the next, let's say, 45 to 60 minutes probably. So yeah, let's dive right in. So here we have an article about DTO projections, and it's about why, when, and how you should use DTO projections. So what is the question here? Is it possible to read projection, make modification, and save that projection, specific fields, back to the table? If so, would it be efficient to update 1 or 2 fields of an entity object, projection objects in persist state, for example, possibly lazy loading? No, it's not possible. I mean, that's the general idea and one of the reasons why we get performance benefits out of this. DTO object is an unmanaged object. That means that Hibernate forgets about it after it instantiated the object. That saves us about, right, with Hibernate 5.3 it was about 20 to 25%, depending on your overall setup, the complexity of the object, and so far. But yeah, in general, it's faster. And then we have the additional benefit that we only fetch a subset of the data and not everything, which gives us performance benefits for read operations. But for write operations, it's really not a great fit. You would need to write your own JPQL or criteria update statement and then make sure to sync the current persistence context and everything. And it creates a lot of work for really mediocre performance benefits for write operations. As I said, for read operations, DTO projections are great. So let me quickly answer that. Hi, copy. No, you can't easily use DTO projections to implement any write use cases. DTOs are unmanaged objects, and your changes, I'm going to increase the font, popular request on one of the last streams, and your changes will not be synchronized to the database. DTOs are only a great projection for read operations. If you need to change data, you should read entities. Okay, we already got 2 questions in the chat, so let's talk about that for a minute. So what do we have here? Neoshon wrote basic fetch type lazy did not work with Hibernate. Is Hibernate not implemented? Well, yes, Hibernate implements lazy or provides lazy fetching for basic attributes, but only if you activate bytecode enhancement. So you probably haven't activated bytecode enhancement in your build process. You can check the Hibernate documentation about that, or it's part of my Hibernate performance tuning online course. You need to add a little bit to your build process so that during the build, Hibernate can inject or can add code to the getter methods of your entity class, so that Hibernate has a chance to implement the lazy fetching. Yeah, it only works with bytecode enhancement, otherwise it doesn't. And then Bob Lopko wrote, would you like to say something about the global cache in JPA? Sure. So you're probably talking about the second level cache in JPA, right? So we have the JPA specification defines 2 kinds of caches. We have the first level cache, which is part of the current persistence context and the Hibernate session if you're using Hibernate. And that one contains all the entities that you have read during your current session. And it also contains dirty entities and is used to implement things like read-ahead optimization, read-behind optimizations, and stuff like that. So that one prevents you from reading the same record multiple times within the same session. The second level cache is a global or shared cache. So there you can have multiple sessions in parallel that all access the second level cache. Due to that, you need to think about concurrency management. There are various concurrency management approaches that are implemented by the different cache implementations, so you don't need to worry about it, you just need to pick one and configure it. And then you also benefit from situations where one session fetched a certain record from the database and you try to read the same one a little bit later. That is a pretty common approach, especially in typical multi-user applications or in other business applications where someone is working on the same data over and over again. The issue with the second level cache, or I wouldn't call it an issue, but the thing you need to keep in mind for the second level cache is you don't get caching for free. Checking if a record is in the cache, putting record into the cache, managing this whole cache infrastructure creates an overhead. So you need to make sure that you read read several times for each write operation. In general, people say about 9 to 10 read operations per write operation on a specific record. As long as you have that, and that's quite often the case for configuration data, product catalogs, and all other kinds of relatively static data, you then might benefit from a second level cache, but only if you fetch your data in a way that the cache is actually used. And that's only the case if you use the entity manager find method or if you traverse an association between your entities. The cache isn't used if you execute a JPQL or criteria query. Then Hibernate executes the query, gets back the result, and works with that one. And yeah, that would be a quick rundown of the second level cache. If you have a specific question about it, then please post it in the chat. But yeah, that would be the quick rundown of second level cache. It's a shared one. You need to make sure to have 9 to 10 read operations per entity, and it gets only used if you're using entity manager find or if you traverse an association. Rodko asks, is there a way to cache only some of the entities using second level cache? Yes, there is. You need to configure your cache mode for the second level cache, and there are 4 options, all non-enable selective and disable selective. I recommend using enable selective. Disable selective is also okay. The 2 others shouldn't be used. So with enable selective, you need to annotate your entity with the cache or cacheable annotation and activate the cache explicitly for that entity. And with disable selective, it's the other way around. All entities are cached and you need to annotate the entity to disable the cache for that specific entity class. But because most entities are not suited for a second level cache, I recommend to use enable selective so that you need to add an annotation and hopefully think about the read-write ratio for that entity class to activate the cache for it. Yeah, that would be that about the cache. Then Niroshan wrote how to create partial disjoint scenarios using Hibernate. What is a partial disjoint scenario? Sorry, right now I've no clue. Okay, in the meantime, I will pick the question from Igor and Niroshan. If you can explain that a little bit further, then I'm happy to answer. So Igor wrote, "Hi Thorben, if I add a new entity to a session without committing it to the DB and then add this new entity to already existing parent entity, then Hibernate generates update statement during commit for both entities. But then I get an exception because no insert was performed." That's strange. So it seems like you're... Right, that sounds like either a bug or a strange error in your code. It's basically a scenario that shouldn't happen, Igor. I think I would need to take a look at the source code there. So if you call the persist method for your new entity, so entity manager.persist for the new entity, and then connect it with the parent entity and manage the association there, then Hibernate should perform the insert statement and then update the association on the parent if necessary. Yeah. So if you can share some code there, then I'm happy to take a look at it. Right now, that sounds like a strange bug. But I would be surprised if it's a Hibernate bug, because adding a new entity and adding an association to the parent entity is a pretty common use case, right? So there is probably something else hidden in your code. Yeah. Thomas wrote, "Hi, does kind of many-to-many with additional attributes where one of associations is one-to-one instead of one-to-many make sense?" I don't know. To me, it sounds like that you're trying to model a one-to-many association with additional attributes, which is totally fine. Because if you have a many-to-many association, then you can split it into two one-to-many associations, which would be the approach for to map additional attributes. So what you would do there is, instead of modeling a many-to-many association on your entities, you would model the association table as an entity class, map the additional attributes there, and then have two one-to-many associations between two one-to-many associations to that association entity instead of the many-to-many association. So now I've no clue where we have this one-to-one association there. Well, if one of these one-to-many association is a one-to-one association, then you can use the same approach. That's totally fine. But then it's not a many-to-many association if you look at the overall picture. Yeah. But yes, if you want to model an association with additional attributes, this would be the right approach. You model the association table as an entity class, map the association records there, and then you add one-to-many or many-to-one associations. Okay. XF360 asks, how can we ensure dev team follows industry practices while using Hibernate JPA in mapping entities? Any check style rules or creating wrapper annotations for project purpose or any other better way? Yeah, well, you can use check style rules, of course. You could use JQ Assistant for overall architecture rules. And then, yeah, there isn't that much more that you can or should do, because how you model your domain model depends on a few things. First of all, the application domain, of course, but then also it also depends on the data that you are managing in your database and the actual number of elements in the association and stuff like that. So in general, I don't think it's a great idea to have a fixed set of roots that you apply to your domain model. Maybe except of using annotating your entity attributes instead of the getter methods, and maybe except of modeling a many-to-many association as a set instead of a list, and these kind of things. But in general, it's really hard to define a general set of roots for your domain model without knowing the or without taking the underlying data and the application domain into account. Rodko wrote, I meant only a subgroup of a specific entity which meet a certain condition. I'm already using enable selective. That was about excluding certain entities from the second level cache. Okay. Only a subgroup of a specific entity. No, you can't do that. You decide on a class level if these entities shall be cached or not. If you have certain entities that shouldn't be cached but are of the same class, then well, maybe you can then model it using inheritance, even so it feels wrong from an architectural point of view. I mean, that's, or from a design point of view, it's not really an inheritance association there, but that would be the only way to differentiate the caching there. Or you would need to use an application level cache, which is also totally fine. Okay, up high road. If I have one-to-many relationship, then if I'm creating an object of parent entity and then create multiple child object and then add it to parent reference object, then do I need every child object to set the parent ref with it, or will it work without it if I do save? Both parent and child entity are having primary key, which is auto-generated. It throws exception ID cannot be null while saving. So yes, you need, if you model a bidirectional association, then you need to update it on both ends. So you would need to set the association on the parent and on the child. And you need to make sure that you persist all entity objects, or that you activate cascade type persist for your association. And if you do that, and if you use auto-generated primary key values, then it should work. And it's always important to update both ends of bidirectional association. Otherwise, Hibernate either might not persist the association if you're not setting it on the owning side of the association, or you just have inconsistent data within your current session, which can cause other issues. Cassio wrote, I have a huge bean with lots of child lists. This bean has an attribute annotated with that version to control concurrency. Okay. So we have optimistic locking. Sometimes I need update only one or two fields on it, but when persisting it, all the chain is updated. How to avoid it? All the chain is updated. I try to update manually only these fields, but then the version gets out of sync with database. There's a way to synchronize it again without fetching the whole bean again. What do you mean by the whole chain is updated? By default, Hibernate updates all columns mapped by that entity class. So Hibernate generates an update statement at the application startup that updates all fields of the columns of the table as soon as one attribute of the entity changed. From a performance point of view, This has the advantage that Hibernate doesn't need to check which attribute exactly changed. So knowing that at least one changed is good enough. And we can reuse the same statement over and over again, which means Hibernate doesn't have to generate new SQL update statements. If you want to have a specific update statement that just updates the changed database columns, then you would need to annotate your entity class with dynamic update, and then Hibernate would generate the SQL update statement every time the entity is dirty and needs to be flushed to the database. That creates some overhead on the Java and Hibernate side, but might be better on your database side. Yeah. Okay. You said updating the whole chain means it updates the bean and children. How do you model these lists of children? Are these associations or are these element collections? Element collections are handled pretty inefficiently because they have no own identity. They are part of the entity object, and that means that the elements in the element collection have no own identity. And due to that, they get updated whenever you update the entity. I recommend to not use element collections in most situations. Okay, so Apai Jane wrote, why do we explicitly need to set the object ref at both sides of child and parent? Does not Hibernate should take care of it implicitly? What if it's unidirectional? Well, Hibernate would take care of it if you activate bytecode enhancement with the parameter, I think it's called enhanced association management or something like that. Then Hibernate injects the required code into the setter methods for your association to update the other end of the association as well. Without that, there's technically just no way how Hibernate could update the other end of the association. That's why we should use utility methods that update or that manage bidirectional associations. But without that, we are just calling setter methods on a Java object for which we implemented the class, and Hibernate doesn't know that class, so Hibernate has no chance to do anything without injecting code into our entity class, and that only happens if you're using bytecode enhancement. So Cassie wrote that the child lists are a list. Well, how did you annotate the? What are the annotations on that list? Is it a one-to-many or many-to-many annotation on it, or an element collection, or what do you do there? Okay, and then I skipped the question from XF360. Okay, thanks. What can be naming conventions for methods that return projections? Can it be get projected entity, or a better way? You currently use fetch entity name with child name for JPA methods that are annotated to use JBQL. Fetch is the prefix we use, just like we have for other methods, find it by D. Yeah, that makes total sense. And yeah, I think I would name them like that. You can use fetch and then maybe the name of the DTO class. So let's say fetch author book value by author name, or get author book value by something else. These are common naming conventions. So Cassie wrote that the association is modeled as a list and annotated with one-to-many. Okay, so if you don't have any cascading on that association, then Hibernate shouldn't update it if you're not changing anything there. Yeah, but I think we don't get anywhere here, Cassia, without taking a look at the code. If you have a small snippet that I can take a look at, then please let me know. Okay. Cascade type all, often removal true, fetch type lazy. Okay, then I would expect if you change the cascade type all and remove it, then nothing should happen, right? Yeah, I would expect if you change the cascade type and remove and exclude the update cascading, then your update shouldn't trigger any changes on the associations. But I'm a little bit confused about the update statements for the child entities. I think we would need to take a closer look at the code and the log output and then really analyze what's going on there. That sounds really strange. Why does during batch operations select queries are printed? Why does during batch operations select queries up during a JDBC batch up high or what? So the batch operation, well, if you have a JDBC batch and you trigger a select statement for whatever reason, then the batch will be cancelled. Well, the batch will be closed and executed, and then if you then add more insert or update operations, then the batch or new batch will be started. XF360, we use Spring JPA. In many cases, we have to pass a proxy object of an entity as repository get1 ID as an input to another JPA method. Can we just use a class instance with just ID populated instead? I'm not sure if I really understand your question, XF360. So if you're calling the repository get1 method, then you just need to provide an ID, which is typically a long, an integer, or a UUID in most cases. If you have your own API and need to provide an entity there, then that might be different, of course. So if you could explain that in a little bit more detail, then I'm trying my best to provide a better answer to that. In the meantime, I take a look at another question here on the blog, and then we get back to the chat in a minute or two. Okay, so we're now looking at this article here about JPQA queries. How to define queries in JPA and Hibernate, and we discuss, okay, what's the structure of a JPQA query, how does it actually work, selections, restrictions, the projection, and so on. And there we have the question. Hello sir, my API service is in JPA Spring Boot. I want to fetch only 6 columns with 4 tables of joins. When I use JPQL, it does it just by single select statement, but fetch nested entities too, which is not required. And using SQL query is easy to join 4 tables and get few rows. What do you suggest? SQL or JPQL? Any performance issues if I use SQL? Hi, Mona. I recommend using a DTO projection that only includes the 4, no, 6, 6. Only includes the 6 entity attributes database columns that you need for your use case. If you use entities, Hibernate will Hello, can you hear me now? Switching to a different microphone now, but I hope that this one works. I mean, it will definitely sound worse than the other one, but based on my controls here, you should hear me now. Okay. Okay, what was I talking about? Yes. So XF360 said that he wants to avoid injecting another repository just to invoke a get1 method, and asked if that's recommended. No, I'd say it's not recommended, especially, or specifically because you decided to separate your database code in a repository, which in general is a good idea. But that also means that you encapsulate your entity manager and all the other JPA database-related stuff in that repository. And it would break the overall approach or concept if you now mix it into your business code, or if you do any other shortcuts there. So I would just inject the additional repository and get the one record that you need. Okay, I now wrote, I'm doing batch insert using Spring JPA properties Hibernate JDBC batch size 1000. That seems to be a lot. But yeah, if you're not running into any memory or performance issues, doing that is okay. You should also activate order insert and order update settings for your JDBC batch to make sure to get the most out of your batch. XF 360 asked about static analysis tools, and I would agree with Jens' recommendation to take a look at ArcUnit or a JQ Assistant. I'm personally a fan of JQ Assistant. I think it's really great. And then Tomasz asked about the optimizer by Vlad Mihalcea. No, I haven't tried it. I don't know. But as I said, I think in general it's not the right way to apply fixed rules to a domain model or to your persistence layer in general without considering the actual data that you're working with. I mean, there's a reason why DBAs recommend to set indices, for example, and after the application was deployed to production, do that for that specific application there. And there's also a reason why databases keep statistics and check these during their query optimization and preparation phase. So we can't do that with Hibernate, but what we can do is we can check, okay, how is the data distributed for a common customer? And then we can double check our persistence layer based on that. And in my experience, that is the by far better approach than setting up a fixed rule on how to handle something and then start handling an association that in the real world contains 3 elements in the same way as one that contains 10,000. There are obvious differences, right? I mean, you can do a lot of things with associations with 3 elements, but you need to be really careful if the associations grow bigger, and you then need to check, okay, if my data is distributed as I expect here and as I found out on my production systems, then what does that actually mean for my implementation? Where can I cut shortcuts to make my life as a software developer easier, and where do I need to really optimize everything? And based on that, I can also decide, okay, in this case, I can join a lot of associations, for example, and fetch everything with a query. And in these other cases, I need to really split that up and make sure that I handle it in a way that I can that it doesn't break if there are hundreds or thousands of elements. And that is a thing that is a common pattern for performance optimizations and for working with any mapping framework in general. So I wanted to add the native queries here. Here, this one, and then also want to not together about complexity of queries first. Okay. Now let me switch back to the browser so that you see what I'm actually doing. Okay. That's a question from Boat regarding Apai's Giant's questions about batch insert with Hibernate. Does batch insertion create managed entities? Yeah, if you're using JDBC batching, then you are creating entity instances and persisting them, and then Hibernate generates an insert statement for it and groups similar insert statements into a batch. If you're not using generation type identity for your primary key generation, and if you don't perform any operations that force Hibernate to execute the query
the insert statement, and if you activate insert order inserts to make sure that all insert statements are, or that that there are multiple insert statements of the same type that are executed after each other, so they can be grouped. Valentine wrote, "Hi Thorben, thank you for great posts. Would it also be possible to pass a list of here? Pass a list of type UUIDs to the query delete from book where B, even when the book has other attributes referenced as element collection." No, that's not possible. That's only possible if you remove all elements of the element collection first. Otherwise, it will fail with foreign key constraint violation. If you remove Hibernate to remove one specific entity, it handles that automatically, but by doing a deletes using a delete statement, Hibernate, no, you are responsible for handling that in all associations and element collections yourself. So Mia wrote in chat that screen does not seem to be clear. Can you check the resolution that of your video? So based on the statistic that I see here from YouTube, everything should be fine, but you might need to adjust the resolution. Is there any way to use transaction when entity manager is inside EJB session? Yes, of course. So the first question there is, do you have any transactional annotations on your code? So by default, I would expect that your transaction starts when the request, let's say, enters the server, and then it gets committed or wrote back when it leaves it. And then you can annotate any method with @transactional and decide if that method requires a new transaction, if it shall run outside of a transaction, and so on. And there are, I think, 7 different settings, different enum values that you can set there. And in general, they should allow you to adjust the transaction handling as you need it. Yeah. So within a Java EE or Jakarta EE container where you're running your EJBs, you also have the JTA implementation, which is the Java Transaction API, is also supported by Spring, and that one manages all these transactions, transaction-related stuff, and you can configure your transaction settings by annotating a method with @transactional. Just make sure that you don't call a method that you annotated with @transactional within the same object. So you need, so the JTA implementation is handled by a proxy object, which wraps your EJB, and you need to inject that EJB somewhere and then call it via its external API so that the proxy has a chance to handle that call and does its thing, like starting or stopping the transaction. Okay, let's post that. Okay, what do we have here? A relation event sequence. Oh yeah, in this article I explain how to use a custom sequence generator. Relation event sequence does not exist. My problem is that the generator name is set to not exist. This independent. No, it's not the end. It's not the generator. It's the database sequence. The generator expects that there is a database sequence with the configured name. In your case, that's sequence. That one is missing in your based on the error message. That database sequence is missing. You can see that it is indicated by the exception class. Which shows that the error occurred in PostgreSQL and not in Hibernate. Nope. Nope. Okay. Well, it's already almost running for an hour already, so I will answer this last question here on the blog. And if you have any questions I should talk about, please post it in the chat. And then I will take a final look at that, and then we'll end today's stream. Okay, so now talking about this one here, about the initialization of lazy associations for Java wrote, hi, I synchronize my bidirectional relationship in services. If I fetch a lazy relationship with JDBC, then call the add method on the list, I will incur an n+1 issue, or JPA will be smart enough to not fetch the list. No, unfortunately, it will fetch the list. Unfortunately, oops, all JPA implementations will fetch the list. List with all associated entities. Okay, so Apai had another question. And he wrote, if in my database table there are 100,000 of records, then if I do any batch insert operation, it takes a lot of time. Well, that then depends on, well, it could depend on a lot of things, to be honest. So just adding the 100,000 and first record in itself wouldn't create a performance issue. If you're just inserting to a table, it doesn't matter how many records are in that table. Hibernate will just create an SQL insert statement and add the record to it. But if you have a huge database, then you might have associations that contain lots of elements, or you might add a lot of records within the same session, which then might create performance issues. So there are dozens of reasons for a performance issue there. So Thomas wrote, shouldn't for a custom sequence generation type be sequence? It was identity in that question. It was identity. Oh, you're right. We are talking about a string prefix sequence ID generator, which is something that I also show here in the article, and then it's generation type identity. Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. Strategy should also be generation type identity sequence because you are using sequence based generator. But to be honest, because in this situation we are, where is it? There. In this situation we are providing our own generator class. So Thomas, I agree. It feels completely wrong to use. It feels completely wrong to use an identity-based sequence generator here. But I'm not even sure if it would break. I would need to give it a try because we are providing our own generator implementation here. But nevertheless, if we are providing our own sequence-based ID generator, we should also use generation type sequence in the code. That is, yeah, and that should be sequence, of course. Okay, and Abhay now wrote, it executes select query for every save operation. How do you save the entity? If you just call the persist method on the entity manager, it shouldn't call a save method, a select statement. There's no reason for it. So you're probably doing something else. A merge, maybe? But if you're just doing an entity manager.persist and provide your entity class, then Hibernate will not trigger any SQL update statement. And due to that, there will also not be any select statement. What do I say? When you just call the entity manager persist method, then Hibernate will just execute the insert statement, and there will be not any select statement. Hibernate explicitly executes it, it's not merge. Well, I would need to take a look at the code. There's definitely something wrong. If you're just calling entity manager persist for your new entity, then it gets inserted in the database without any additional select statement or anything. So yeah, maybe you can post the question on Stack Overflow with a code snippet, or maybe add it to the comments here on below the video after we end the stream, and then I'm happy to take a look at it next week. Dive into more details there. Okay, then I want to thank you for joining and for asking all these questions. Yeah, I will be back next week, Wednesday as always, 2:30 p.m. And yeah, thanks for attending, and see you next week. Have a great day. Bye.